Good morning. It's taken the last 5 years of research to get to this point, and I am deeply honoured and delighted to be able to share the first fruits of my research into the application of the calculus of indications to the analysis of story structure with you at this conference. The question I'm going to be looking at is, what can Spencer Brown's calculus of indications teach us about story? The structure of the presentation is going to be in 4 sections. After a short introduction, I'm going to give you a demonstration of 13 steps I use to look at story structure. And then we're going to look specifically at the classification of stories that results from applying the COI, the calculus of indications, and then a brief overview of preliminary findings. So, by way of introduction, as you will all know, there are 6 symbols in laws of form. I'm going to show you how they apply to the analysis of linear story structures. I'll explain what I mean between linear and dynamic story structures later, but you will all be familiar with stories that follow linear structures. They are to do with characters that go through a series of events that typically resolve an initial problem at the end of a story, and that's why we have the story in the first place. So, in laws of form, Spencer Brown uses a mark of recursion to indicate remarking the thing in chapter 11. I use it to indicate story openings and closings. The once upon a time and lived happily ever after opening and closing end. That was me. I didn't set a timer. I set it to... Yeah, right. So I've lost my time. Anyway, somebody will keep time.
I will. And that was the double cross, right?
That was the double cross. So, we haven't come to that. Okay. The mark of indication stands for a who, when, where. A character in a particular time, in a particular place. The mark of cancellation I use in dynamic story structures, so I won't be looking at that a lot in this presentation, but it indicates a qualitative change in the relationship between the knower and the known. The backward step, which Spencer Brown uses to indicate a contraction, stands for a backward step in a character's journey that takes them from a problem towards its solution. I think of stories as a seiche tide, where you have a enclosed body of water, and then the wind blows on it, sets up this oscillatory wave that then calms down. And you get this backwards, forwards motion. And the forward steps are events that propel the character towards the achievement of their goal, the solution of their problem. There is another symbol used in laws of form, which is the bivalence symbol. Now, it only stands for the potential for an expansion or a contraction to happen. It is an important symbol in the analysis of story structure, and it stands for an Aristotelian categorical cognitive dissonance. And here I'm referring to Aristotle's 10 categories of being. And usually it's in the form of defeated expectation in the quality of interaction between 2 characters. There are 2 further rules we apply. 2 similar quality steps can be reduced to 1, compressed to 1, and 1 can expand. And triplicities of backwards, forwards, backwards, or forwards, backwards, forwards, or bivalence, backwards, bivalence, can contract to 1 step that equates to the outer value of these. Similarly, 1 can expand to those patterns. So with 6 symbols, you can map an indefinitely detailed story, which can then be condensed to a very simple outline. Here's what it looks like in practice. So I'm going to take a story to analyse the story of the enormous turnip. It's short, it's simple, it serves the purpose. The version I'm using is by Alexander Afanasyev, who wrote it down in Russian when he collected it. In Russian it's called Rybka, turnip. The summary of the story is this. Grandfather planted a turnip. When he went to harvest it, he couldn't pull it out. He called for help. Various characters in turn tried to help him pull it out. The last added its strength to the cumulative build-up, and they all managed to pull the turnip out of the ground, enabling the grandfather to harvest the turnip. Yay! Problem solved. So in this version you have grandfather, aided by grandmother and granddaughter and the dog, and behind the dog, this is important, you have 5 beetles. And it's the last beetle that makes all the difference. So, we next look at how the narrative version of the story opens, but all stories have a once upon a time opening, implied or stated. This one has the opening implied, and it comes straight in with grandfather planted a turnip. You could argue that the title, Rybka, is the opening, it leads you in, but that's a question for the interpreter to decide. So step 5 is, who's the main character? In complex stories, you follow a storyline, a story structure line, for each character, and then look at how they combine through time. For those people for whom time has come up time and time again in this conference so far, here's the answer. So, we have grandfather. He's situated in rural Russia, probably 19th century, and at the beginning of the story, he's in a neutral condition. He's planted a turnip. It's neither good nor bad, it just is. His problem is that when he tries to harvest the turnip, he can't, and that's when the story kicks off. And it's because of that problem that the story starts in the first place. The overview of the story is that it's cumulative. When a new character enters and finds that they can't pull up the turnip, they're in exactly the same situation as the grandfather was when he started. So their storylines just cumulatively map, and you can render them as one. The friends or helpers are there just to help. So what we do is, to analyse story structure, rearrange the events in a story in chronological order. That applies to stories where you have flashbacks or memories coming in. It doesn't apply here. Our job is easy. Then we look for these satietide patterns, the resistance, the flow, the unfortunate, fortunate events, and map them out. Here, the problem, which is unfortunate, is that grandfather can't harvest his turnip. Fortunately, he can call for help. And this is a key thing in the methodology. Whenever there's a meeting between two characters, or a character and an object, that halts the flow of story. There's a resistance, so I interpret that as a backward step. It's counterintuitive, but it's essential to the understanding of how story structure works. So, grandmother arrives. He doesn't know whether she's going to help him. They have to have a conversation. In that conversation, it's decided that she will, so that moves the story forward. But in order to even try to pull the turnip out of the ground, they have to put their hands on the turnip. That's another meeting. They try, they fail, and when the fifth character comes in, that's when they manage to solve the problem. So how do the symbols fit this pattern? If we just looked at the body, it's 3 pairs of backwards-forwards steps. In total, you have the opening, the character, those 6 steps, the closing, that's the character in their final condition, the end state, and then the closing is implied. Then we ask, can we condense? And yes, we can. We've already done that by mapping all the different characters' lines to the single storyline. The next thing is, compare them to a body of 18 different story structures I've found to date. Here they are. I will go through them in brief later on, but just a shortcut, this story maps exactly to the quest structure. The quest structure typically has an opening, a character in an initial situation, and that character has a problem. That drives this system of going on a journey, on that journey meeting a friend or helper, meeting an enemy or a hindrance, and arriving at either an outcome, which could be a new problem, loop back to 3, and that very often happens in a try again structure. Think Jack and the Beanstalk, three little pigs. Until the problem is resolved, you get to a resolution, and the story can close. And what the calculus of indications allows us to do for the very first time is visualize very clearly, very precisely, what a particular story structure looks like. And this is what the quest structure looks like. It is, if you know laws of form and the calculus of indication, it is intuitive. So, how does that help us classify story structures? Well, there are 4 ways of classifying them. I've mentioned linear dynamic, but it's easiest if I take you through the distinction between linear and dynamic, looking at the quality of an initial step. And this is where the calculus of indications gives great insight into how a story structure works. At the beginning of a story, there is an opening. Once upon a time, there was. What happens next? There are 6 possible symbols we could put in. We know that mark equals mark. So if there's another mark happening, then it's just greater detail. You remember the black dog example. So we can ignore that and say there are 5 possibilities. The mark-based ones lead to dynamic structures, and the step-based ones lead to the linear structures. Let's look at the dynamic structures first. There are 2 dynamic structures, and dynamic and linear structures work symbiotically. So the first is a revelation structure. It comes in after the opening and the initial character are set up, and it follows what I call I came, I saw, I conquered structure. Veni vidi vici. I came because I heard a rumour, I saw, I verified with my own eyes, and I acted in order to change things. And boom, that dynamic process leads to a static outcome of change. And this is how it underlies the quest structure. Each pair of moves has that revelation quality to it in turn. So the problem means something has to happen. What do? Something needs to be done. Right, we call in help, we assess the thing, we do our strategy, and boom, we act on it, see if it works. The Chinese story structure is my favourite story structure. It is the structure. This is the structure that underpins every single linear structure I have found. It goes through a pattern very similar to the circular one we looked at the end of day 1. But there's earth, yin-yang imbalance, in the middle. It then goes through a cycle of 4 seasons. You have spring, summer, autumn, winter, linking to the other elements in the cycle. And they link to principles of balance at the centre. Something emerges in the spring, division of root and shoot system, separation of fruits in the autumn, and reintegration. The water goes down to the earth, the seeds are planted in the soil, allowing the growth and new birth in spring. And this is how it fits in with the quest structure. There are 2 cycles around that. There are patterns you can see, but I don't have time to go into them now. The linear structures, if a character starts with a problem, there are 10 story structures that arise from that. And this is where it gets interesting. The transformation structure is the structure of Ovid's Metamorphoses. There is typically a transgression against the natural order and a restoration of balance in the natural order, but things are never the same. Remember that the backwards step can expand to backwards, forwards, backwards, and you see that the quest is just an expansion of the transformation structure. But the third step so 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, the fifth mark, the fifth symbol, sorry, in the quest structure is the meeting with a friend or helper that arises and is contained in the transgression against the natural order in the transformation structure. And similarly, the seed of the negative is contained in the positive move of the transformation structure. Really interesting stuff. The trickster is very similar to the quest, but the bivalent barbs mark the place where a friend or helper appears to be a friend or helper, but is actually behaving like an enemy or hindrance. The trickster variation is when a character encounters something that sets up a cognitive dissonance, but there is no intent to trick. Typically then a nested structure has to unfold that explains the cognitive dissonance and resolves it, and the story can come to a close. Voyage and Return, Death and Rebirth are basically quest structures with nested quest structures in different places. Call and Response has two variations, and it's a combination of transformation and quest in different positions. The dilemma structure is a structure that is open-ended, and it demands that the audience come in and reach a conclusion for the storyteller. The perpetual motion structure is a structure that just goes on and on. There are very few stories that follow this structure, but there are examples in other genres. When a character starts with a forward move, there are 4 story structures that emerge from that. The rags to riches is the Cinderella structure, and the calculus of indications allows us to show for the first time that what makes the story of Cinderella is that it starts positive. And there is a nested quest for a saviour character that comes in at the end. The Kisho Tenketsu is a structure with cognitive dissonance in it that is resolved at the end. If that cognitive dissonance has to be resolved by the audience to reach a consensus closing, then that is an open-ended version, and the creation myth starts positive and just flows forward. That's what Genesis 1 follows, although the Chinese story structure underlines that particular story in a very complex way, and I'd be very interested to compare notes with Walter on that later. So, what happens when a character starts off with a cognitive dissonance? Well, there are 2 story structures that emerge from that, the koan and the riddle. Now, a riddle is posed, and we all know the answer to the riddle, but we don't know that we know it in the asking of the riddle. So once we've resolved it, right, it's a recognition. A riddle is solved. A koan is realised. We don't know we know the answer, and that leads to enlightenment, ideally. And that's why the unmarked state symbol is the perfect symbol for that. So there are 2 more ways of classifying that arise through the application of the calculus. Threshold and non-threshold. All the threshold stories are stories in which you have fairy godmothers, angels, demons coming in. There's a threshold crossing from one dimension of being to another. Non-threshold stories happen on one dimension of being. These are the typical folk tales, anecdotes. The creation myth combines both, just as an interjection combines both qualities of a noun, an onoma, and a verb, a rema, to create a unitary, ternary, if you like, unity of a logos. There are 3 types of story endings. In a closed structure, the storyteller will bring the story to a close themselves. In an open-ended structure, the audience will need to come in to bring the story to a close. And in 2 structures, there are no clear endings to the story. They go on indefinitely. And these 2 are the perpetual motion and the creation myth structure. And there seems to be a flow towards the creation myth structure. This is the structure that story wants us to follow in our lives. And this links to work, I don't know if you're familiar with it, by Mikhail Csikszentmihalyi, on flow, and that state of being in the zone. So, what can Spencer Brown's calculus of indications teach us about story? It can teach us a lot. So my findings so far is that it provides a simple yet powerful visual interpretation of story structure. We can look at something and see, yeah, I recognise that pattern. And these are the qualities around it. Very useful. It also provides greater transparency and ease in analysing story structures across different genres. And academics hate me for this, but one of my favourite things is saying the story of the enormous turnip, the story of the three little pigs, the structure of a mathematical proof, and an academic essay all follow the same story structure. They are all quest structure stories. So we need to perhaps redefine what we think of in terms of story. A story is not just fiction, it's not just literary narrative, it is much more. And the content neutral quality of the calculus of indications allows us to be much more transparent and see the commonalities across genres, which are considered very often differently and unjustly so. It gives us greater insight into the relationship between story structures. I've talked about the relationship between transformation and the quest briefly. That's one example. And there are laws of story. There are certain things you can do and certain things you can't do. If you follow the rules of story, then the story will flow, it will work. If you go against it, it won't. So the understanding of the laws of story will help you if you want to write better. So it provides potential for significant new insights in the fields of narrative studies, writers, screenwriters, storytellers, but also in the field of education. You can apply this to problem solving. It can be applied to problem solving in work. It can also provide new insights in the field of therapy, because every story structure is linked to a different kind of problem. And the different kinds of problems contain within themselves the seed of their solution, which is why we have different story structures. And these qualities are embedded within us. And the calculus of indications allows us to see this with greater clarity. But that's not all. The most important thing is that this approach provides an opportunity for us to get to know the workings of the unknown storyteller a little better. Thank you. Question in the back.
Thanks for that, Leon. That was really fun. I'm someone who works primarily in literary analysis, so this is a much more comfortable space for me than exercises in post-Boolean algebra. But I wanted to point out something, which is that your use of the laws of form here is primarily structuralist and cartographic. You're sort of using it to visualize a kind of a form that you've located in these stories across or within genres and how they operate. But there's one story that kept occurring to me during your talk that makes me think there's something that laws of form can also do for you, perhaps. And this is a more post-structuralist reading of it. But that's Moby Dick. Remember the beginning. Call me Ishmael. Which is an injunctive, right? Now what happens in that particular moment is that the crossing creates both the narrative and the audience. And that's something that every opening of every story does to a degree, I think, and that laws of form, to my reading, is what's most interesting about it, is that it invokes necessarily the creation of these worlds, these scenes of not just writing and structure, but the generative power of worlds that are created for us when we read them as well. That to say, call me Ishmael, is to create not just a word on the page or a world, but something that that I'm implicated in somehow
Okay.
as well. Is that fair?
Really good question, but let me make a very important distinction here. I'm looking at story structure, not plot pattern. So you're working on the level of plot pattern and narrative that I could start, I am called Ishmael, call me Ishmael, Ishmael is my name. All those are different ways of saying the same thing.
But it's not the same thing.
I know it isn't, but it's different ways of saying, well, isn't it? Is it? My name is Ishmael. Call me Ishmael.
Very different. No,
All right, let's... it is a decision by the narrator by the writer to call the narrator in the first person to state an injunction. I'm looking at story structure. This can be applied to narrative pattern. You can look at the story structure of the narrator, you can look at the story structure of the writer, you can look at the story structure of the reader. But I'm interested in what was the first event in the story that is being told through Moby Dick. Where does that come in? It doesn't necessarily come at the beginning. And then map out the sequence in chronological order. Yeah. I've done a whole lot on plot patterning, including applying this to formal structures in poetry, different types of sentences. This is just the tip of the iceberg. One at the back and then you.
I just had a question. I wanted to just start off by asking, say that if you start off with the notion that sequences of events that happen temporally might or might not have any, we perceive them as having connections connected to each other. So my question is, these story structures and the application of love of form to all these different patterns in stories and plots and narratives, could they be used as like a tool for perceptual psychology in how we construct events in our minds and how we perceive sequences of events, and possibly why we're always upset when we see a story or watch a movie as to why there's no resolution, or why, for example, there's a good example of this. There was a series called, I can't remember what it was called, but anyway, there's a scene where you see someone lying on the ground, and there's a big tall wall, and there's a building, and the camera pans up, and you see someone looking over. But immediately the audience would think, okay, that person must have pushed that person. But when you go to the next, after this commercial, the next episode says, no, it was something different. So it's automatically tricking our perception to thinking, okay, these two events were connected. I see someone dead lying on the floor, and then I see someone peering over, panning up, and then maybe I've made the connection but that was a false connection.
So tricks to structure.
Yeah.
Is unfolding. Yeah. There's a great book which you can get on YouTube as a video called Zoom by a Turkish author. Just illustrations, and it zooms out and out and out and out and out. And what you think you see is not what you see when it's revealed. Brilliant. Someone else? Yes.
I have two questions. The first, I'm not sure you noticed this, but some of your little sequences of laws of form symbols actually are equations, and others are not. Equations in the sense of laws of form. Is that intent, or is that...
You'd have to give me an example and we can talk about it.
Well,
but let's have a different
question.
conversation. Yes.
There's one very famous story that has been, pages and pages written about it, that has a very peculiar structure that is actually quite pregnant, and you know what I'm talking about. This is the Purloined Letter by Allen Poe.
Yeah, John Kunz has written a book and he's applied laws of form to the analysis of it.
Oh, really?
Okay, so...
where
are we? John Kunz, here he is.
Oh my God! Wow, that's very responsive.
So, yeah, there's a hand that conceals, a hand that reveals, and he interprets the unmarked state re-entering the mark on the left in a continuous, recursive manner. This is the diagram from his analysis. So he's going one way, he's going another way, but look at the diagram that comes from chapter 11. If you're familiar with that, it's different. Remember, there's a circle, a square, a tube under, and the tube goes to a blank space outside the square. And he says this is like the game of Mora. Now, in Mora, the outcome is uncertain. Are you going even? Are you going even odd? That's the whole point of the game. It's like scissors, paper, stone. But here he says, while the police go left, Dupin goes right. This is the pattern. There is no randomness to it. There's no uncertainty. And in Spencer Brown's work, the tube always comes inside the square boundary. So, has he read Spencer Brown's work correctly? The differences in interpretation of this are not convincing to me. I haven't understood how Johns Kunze is really looking at Spencer Brown's work. And I feel he's just trying to make a connection that works on a narrative level rather than a deep structural level that I'm looking at the story at. And this is what he says. Adjusting to Spencer Brown's way of writing marks, with the unmarked innermost space to the left, we say, in following this convention, to put to the right side, with the benefit that this switch emphasizes how the minister's point of view is adroitly, droit is right in French, folded into the plane of representation to create a double channel, occulting invisibility within visibility. Make of it what you will.
Yes. Leon?
Yes.
How does the story know when to stop?
Very
in the middle, you can have your repetitive bits. Of course, in the notation, it all looks the same. So you could go on forever. But we don't do that, do we? So how do you know when to stop?
So, in the book I've written, which I'm looking for a literary agent for, if not a publisher, I go into this in one of the chapters. There is the story structure. Then there is nesting, like Arabian Nights. Then there is latticing. And latticing is like the Greek myths. They are all connected. And in the world of Greek myths, where do you start, where do you end? There is a Jewish storyteller I'm actually studying under in an oral tradition, and much of my work on this is influenced by that methodology, that practice. Her name is Shonali Kumbers, and she should be more widely known of than she is. She is the last living survivor of a 100-year-old tradition that she was handed down from her grandmother handed down to her. It skips generations within Dritsila families, and she contains within her 4,000 stories. But narrative academics just dismiss out of hand, it is not possible. She is living proof that it is.
Are you saying then that it's normative?
Her stories, the point about latticing is that her stories, like the world of Greek mythology, all interconnect. You can enter at one point of the lattice, go through here, end up there, finish a story here in one telling, but never finish the one you've started with. But they're all contained in this mythopoeic universe.
They're like the Marvel universe.
Even better, even richer, even more wonderful. There's a question there?
Okay, we'll do another question.
Going back to the mathematics, the logic part is full of story. Logic is always a story. A implies B, B implies C, C implies D, and you get from A to D is a kind of a story. Or some are more dramatic, like a proof by contradiction. So I'm curious about how you would take those and put them into your notation.
Well, I work on logic and applying Spencer Brown's work to classical
I'm
logic.
talking about the all-in-some part, which is more complex.
Okay.
But just the drama of, for example, a proof by contradiction. It really is a story. It would a story form.
So
probably stories that actually really follow that form.
Proof.
So I'm just saying it would be interesting to.
My mapping of the quest structure onto that is that you have a topic you want to talk about. You have a problem which is you don't know which of two opposing views is correct or not. So you go on a journey, you present your methodology. You then present your arguments for, those are your friends and helpers. You present your arguments against, those are your enemies and hindrances. If, in working through, you find that your workings are incorrect and it's the other sides that are correct, then that's the resolution, but your friends or helpers have been defeated.
Right, but in the storytelling, it isn't in either or. The drama of the proof by contradiction is, let's assume that the square root of 2 is rational, and then we take an adventure. And we don't see, if we never saw the proof before, how that adventure is going to turn out, but here we are, and then, a contradiction has arisen. And that's the dramatic point, at which point everything collapses back to the other possibility.
Yeah, it would be interesting to map that with you.
Yeah.
There are several possibilities for that. One last one?
Okay.
Perhaps.
It's really fascinating.
Thank you.
In the patterns that you're generating, have you seen scope? So these are the primitive encodings you've made. Is there a sort of meta language that you can build out of canonical forms that keep reoccurring? Sort of.
I've tried to play with them. I've tried to mix the positions of different moves in a story structure, steps in the story structure that have qualitative aspects to them. And that breaks the rules of story. You cannot tell a story that way. Nesting, you can have different story structures nesting within each other. The 18 structures of what I've found to date. There may be others out there, I don't know. But I've analysed a lot.
I'm intrigued as to how scalable this is. This is through your brain at the moment, isn't it?
Yeah. Which is why it needs to be out in the world. Others need to engage with it now. I've done my bit.
Okay. So I'm interested. So it just made me think of Edgar Morin's sort of statement that a new knowledge of organisation is capable of creating a new organisation of knowledge. And I was thinking that you could have instead of a DOI for a document, you could have a COI of a document. It's
nice.
It's encoding in terms of the calculus of indication.
So one of the things I want to do is get a group of storytellers together, get a group of writers together, and work through some of these things, see how it influences their practice.
All right, we're going to be reconvening at 11:30 to get together for our item. Just to remind everyone, we are going to visit the Stafford Beer Archive, visit the Stafford Beer Archive, visit the Stafford Beer